take this moment now to silence your cell phones. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Taj Greenlee, Assistant Director of 92i Talks. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our very special folks presentation tonight, Bret Stephens and Frank Bruni in conversation with Thane Rosenbaum. I will soon turn over the program to our longtime moderator and friend, Thane Rosenbaum. But first, if you're a fan of this evening's program, do take a look at 92y.org for more great events like this one. Next week, we have Who is Alex Trebek, celebrating 35 seasons of Jeopardy, moderated with Michael McKeon. And now, our host. Thane is an essayist, novelist, and distinguished fellow at New York University School of Law, where he directs the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society. He's the author of numerous books of fiction and nonfiction, and serves as the legal analyst for CBS News Radio. We are eager to have you, the audience, participate in the discussion. So please write your questions on the index cards the ushers have handed out, and we'll collect them during the event. If you are receiving CLE credit for this program, please do remember to sign out at the end of the event. And now, please welcome Thane Rosenbaum.
Thank you, Taj. Welcome, everyone, to the Folks Conversation series at the 92nd Street Y. You're in for a real tremendous treat tonight. Our guests tonight, Frank Bruni and Bret Stephens. I'll tell you a little about them in a moment, but it's not just they're great writers and they're incredibly articulate and handsome. But I think you should know that they're friends. In fact, we're all friends, but they're friends, which is interesting because Frank, as you may know, they're both columnists for the New York Times. Frank is a progressive liberal to some degree. I would say he would cop to that. And Bret is a longtime neoconservative. And so now we live in an era in which Democrats and Republicans refuse to speak to each other, but yet at the New York Times, these guys are pals. Now, I imagined, they'll tell me in a second, I imagined that when Bret came over from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times not a long time ago, that first day in the lunchroom was tough. It's high school at the New York Times, you know? Bret went to a table, he was sitting by himself. The New York Times, you know, is a little left of center. There were people there giggling at him, making faces. He bared it well. Frank walked up to the table and said something like, "Hey, buddy, is that chair taken?"
And here's a Kit Kat, yeah.
Yeah. And that's how the friendship began. Or maybe you can tell us how the friendship began in a moment. But let me introduce our friends. Frank, as you know, has been a longtime writer for the New York Times. He's now an op-ed columnist. He's had a distinguished career at the Times. Among other things, he was the White House correspondent, covered the White House during the George W. Bush era. He, for a number of years, was the restaurant critic for the New York Times, if you remember this about Frank. He is the author of several books, two of which I really adore. The one is a memoir that is related to his work as a food critic, as a restaurant critic. And it's a book also it's a memoir about his family and their relationship to food. And there's this other book, classic contrarian book for those who think that it only matters, you must go to an Ivy League school in order to achieve greatness. And it's a book about debunking that myth. And he's also a political analyst for CNN. Please welcome Frank Bruni. And both of them have actually been guests both at the 92nd Street Y and at Folks before. Bret Stephens, again, yet another columnist for the New York Times. Many people don't know that when he was still in his 20s, he basically went to Israel and resurrected the Jerusalem Post as their editor-in-chief. He was like a boy wonder. The paper was about to fold, and he was working in the Brussels, I think, office of Bureau of the Wall Street Journal, and he took a job, and he showed up just on time for the Second Intifada and covered the Second Intifada for the Jerusalem Post, and he wound up back at the Wall Street Journal, where he had the Global View column, if you remember that. That was the foreign affairs column. He was also the deputy editorial editor. He was served on the editorial board. He's the author of a wonderful book about American and isolationism and the effect that that's had on our foreign policy. And he is a political analyst for MSNBC. Please welcome Bret Stephens. So I made up the lunchroom thing, although if it's true, tell us. But I want to say...
It's effectively true.
Yeah, it's effectively true. There was giggling. That's true. But I want to say that on some respects, Donald Trump brought you together. That he's somewhat responsible. That's not true, and I wonder why. I'm not sure. Frank is already saying no. I'm not sure Bret would have even been at the New York Times. First of all, did you know each other during when you weren't at the Times?
We did a little bit.
Slightly,
a little bit, yeah.
Mutual friends.
But,
I would see him at parties and he wouldn't talk to me.
Yeah.
I'm kidding. No, I was shaking my head when you said the Donald Trump thing, because it is true that a lot of people on the right or left side of the center line have been united in their opposition to Donald Trump. But the bottom line on Bret, and I don't want to make him blush too much, is he's an exquisite writer. Mm-hmm. He is an unbelievably generous and sensitive colleague. He loves to gossip and he loves to drink. And if he proposed to me, I'd have to give it serious consideration.
You heard that here on the stage of the 92nd Street Y.
My kids are in the audience, otherwise I might just do so now.
Yeah.
So there is a somewhat of a unifying theme with Donald Trump to some degree. You're both critics of the president as editorial writers. What is it like to be in a profession where the President of the United States keeps saying that you're the enemy of the people? The CPAs are not enemies of the people. Florists are not enemies. I mean, this is a very serious thing. This is a very serious charge. Think of all the jobs that the president is not identifying as the enemy of the people.
I mean, if he had said lawyers are the enemy of the people.
That's true. But you knew that. But I wonder whether is it demoralizing? Is it incentivizing? Is it good for your business? I mean, it does seem to some degree that the readership at the Times is up. Readership at both of the networks that you appear on is up. I wonder, to some degree, your profession is being completely trashed. And on the other hand, more people are seemingly interested in what you're doing than perhaps before. Can you speak to that?
I mean, the answer is all of the above. I've been on the receiving end, as have many of our colleagues at the Times, of threats that were serious, one in particular that's now being prosecuted. And that is a scary thought. I mean, if you know the New York Times building, you might have noticed that Jersey barriers just went up outside of our building, and that's not for aesthetic reasons. On the other hand, it's a reminder that what we do is genuinely significant. That democracy requires more than just the institutional checks and balances stipulated in the Constitution, but external watchdogs, and that when we are at our best, and that is definitely not always the case, but when we are at our best, we are that watchdog. I think, it's now become sort of a source of branding. Democracy dies in darkness for the Washington Post. The Times has one about truth. But the brands work because they're true, because they say something fundamental. And it has, Donald Trump, among his many extraordinary attributes, has done more to revive the news business in the last 2 years than just about anyone except, of course, for Jeff Bezos.
True.
In many ways,
yeah.
Jeff Bezos. Yeah.
But Frank, that's true about the news business, but at the same time calling it fake news. I mean, this is the first time, I think, in American history that we've invoking the language that news is fake, facts are not facts, truth is not truth. There is, I guess, an irony that Trump was a reality star who believes in fake news.
But that's a problem that honestly is so much bigger than his charge of fake news about reporting that he doesn't like from the New York Times or the Washington Post or anywhere else. I mean, that's just part of what I think is a much bigger crisis for us right now, which is the way people get their information and their news, and the way in which people customize it, end up living in these very narrow silos where they're constantly only hearing exactly what they already believe, echoed and amplified back at them. And that's the bigger picture and the bigger problem that goes way beyond Donald Trump's specific claims of fake news. I want to say, though, I agree with everything Bret said, but it has actually been an unbelievably rewarding time to be a journalist, because every time he does that from his pulpit, whether you're walking through Fairway, whether you're walking down the street, the number of people in this city in particular who go out of their way to tell you, I'm behind you, I appreciate what you do, you know, that has been unbelievably touching, and I think that's a small part of what we see in terms of the expanded business and all that. And I get a little uncomfortable when we have these conversations about what journalists are going through, because I think the crisis of the Trump presidency is for all Americans, not just journalists. We're a tiny, tiny sliver of
it. In the sense that there's a larger danger to democracy itself.
I think the dangers to democracy are exponentially outnumber the dangers to journalists. Yeah.
Well, and one might add, look, the charge of fake news is corrosive. This kind of demagoguery has been practiced before, and it has worked before. And you know, Frank gave a really significant, very superb speech. I'm thinking back almost about a year ago, maybe 8 months ago in California. The news isn't fake, but it is flawed. I think that was the title of the speech. And we do ourselves no favors when some of the journalism is in fact slanted. Some of the journalism does contain not fake news, but mistaken news. There's a big distinction between deliberately faking news and making mistakes, which is the same distinction as, you know, between lying and simply getting something wrong. But when we fall down on the job in public ways, and it has happened over the last couple of years, that is simply ammunition in the hands of our critics. At our best, this should mean that we need to really sharpen our game when it comes to making sure that we are being fair, that we are being accurate, and that we are being responsive to a large segment of America that does feel condescended to by an East Coast sort of establishment media and feels misunderstood by us as well.
Frank, you actually talked a little about this recently in that essay in your column about, remember the story about the kids from a Catholic school that went to Washington, D.C.
From Covington, in Kentucky, yeah.
And then there was the drummer, and they stared each other down, and it was interpreted. And Frank's essay was, well, you know, this is a rush, the way that we now, in fact, distill the news itself, that there's the speed, the immediacy of Twitter, that there is a kind of fierceness, I think you said, of our convictions,
well,
a rush to judgment, and that only burnishes this idea that we can get things wrong when we just don't have the same kind of necessary oversight. And I want to, before you answer this question, I want to bring out another essay that you wrote recently. Did you see Frank's, what I now call the Bruni Super Bowl essays? There were 2 columns that had to do with the Super Bowl. One had to do with the bad officiating in the championship games and how that led to a kind of crisis in confidence, that we're having less faith in our institutions, both in politics and the NFL. Right. And then my really favorite one was your Tony Romo one, where you said, well, you know, Tony Romo's really now become famous for being able to anticipate the play, and that's because he knows stuff. And now we're living in an era where everyone with a phone claims to know stuff. And a president who really doesn't think that it matters that you read books or read briefing memos. And everyone just has an opinion based on knowing stuff. And Frank's column was really about, no, remember the days when you actually had to earn it, that you actually had to know stuff before you were given a platform to speak? So maybe you
Wait, before he answers the question, I just want to give you an insight into Frank Bruni's mind, which is when that column appeared, he sent a note to me and a few intimate friends saying, don't read that column. It's so bad. I had a million things to do. I just rushed it out.
No, what I really said was I was a little hungover when I wrote it. That's what I said, but he's editing it.
And there was, and alcohol may have played a part. and it was one of the very best columns he's written.
I was just going to say, what does it say about me? Because I love that one. So,
It
right.
says I should drink more.
So speak to this response to what Bret said about when we get it wrong.
No, I would back up a little bit, and I would say in terms of that whole idea of the media, Donald Trump came after us with the wrong charges and the wrong ammunition and a fraudulent and a cynical, and he knows it's wrong argument. But he came after us because we were vulnerable, and we are vulnerable for some reasons that are our own fault in making. We're flawed, not in the ways he claims we're flawed, but we are flawed in other ways. And I think Bret defined some of those ways very, very well. And what I was writing about in terms of Covington, which is among, I think, our flaws and ways in which we lose the public trust right now, is something happens, right? And before it's entirely clear what's happened, everybody's got their brand and their banner. I get outraged by this, I get outraged by this, and they rush to Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or whatever to essentially vent the outrage you expect from them based on an opportunity they see for it before they fully digested the opportunity and figured out whether the outrage is even appropriate to the circumstance.
And you're saying it's not just the readers, the writers themselves are doing it.
No, I'm talking about the writers.
Right, you're saying because we, as readers, we consume what we want to hear.
Right,
We
but
rush to
I'm
Facebook,
talking about writers.
the reporters reporting the story.
In a journalism landscape that is more overcrowded with punditry than ever before, and that's a whole other discussion because it's cheaper to publish and produce punditry than actual investigative reporting and that sort of thing.
You don't need a bureau.
Right,
You don't have to go do research.
Yeah,
right?
you don't need, the Times, in keeping a robust Baghdad bureau forever, had security, et cetera. Very expensive to do that. And not the stories that are clicked on the most. And it says a great deal about the news organization and its values, that it continues to fund things that do not equal clicks, but that are about the heart and soul of the news business. But what I'm talking about is there are many purveyors of opinion, purveyors of things on the line between news and opinion who have a particular take they're always giving you. And they're out there on Twitter with it, and it means they're interpreting all events with a bias, but it's not a left-right bias, it's a bias in favor of the argument that they're known for and that you press a button and they make. And I think the public experiences that as somewhat fraudulent, and it doesn't in the long haul, or over the long haul, earn us the trust of readers and viewers and listeners.
One lesson I learned when I was the editor of the Jerusalem Post is that the most stereotyped people in the world, and by stereotyped people, I don't mean Jews or Palestinians. I mean this kind of Jew or that kind of Palestinian. They're always going to surprise you if you actually practice journalism. You will go and meet settlers who are also like hippie stoners. And you think, oh, the settlers, they're all these right-wing fanatics, but there's always a flip side. You will meet Palestinians, including Palestinians affiliated with radical organizations that also have their surprises. And journalism at its best always has to make large allowances for the capacity to be surprised by the people that you are otherwise most eager to stereotype. I think where we go wrong in big ways is when we fall prey to those stereotypes. I mean, why was, for instance, the story about UVA, the rape hoax at UVA, why was that so readily believed? Because so many prejudices that we had, or at least segments of the media had, about white, entitled, frat kids at UVA behaving in certain ways, all of them seemed to be confirmed by that narrative. So people jumped on and said, well, this has got to be right because this is the classic UVA frat boy, and this is how you might expect they would behave. And of course, this turned out to be one of the big egg on your faces story that not only, never mind, damaged the journalist in question or Rolling Stone magazine, I think damaged the profession as a whole. And it also, by the way, damaged victims of rape because they would always have to live under the burden, well, you never know because there was that UVA story. And I think this is true not simply as journalists, but as human beings. You always have to look at someone and say, I'm expecting this. There has to be some large allowance in my mind that they will not be the people who will conform to the stereotype that I had about them. And I might add, going to the Times, destroyed a great many stereotypes I had harbored when I was at the Wall Street Journal
Good.
about the kind of people who are at the Times.
Good.
You know, and to add to what Bret's saying, I mean, some of the most stereotyped people in America by journalists are Trump voters. And some of the stereotypes hold true, but some don't. And I mean, I remember, it's one of the reasons why it's important to get out there. I remember going to an early Trump rally in South Carolina just before its primary and spending a couple of hours there interviewing the voters who'd come. And each of those people, their take on reality wasn't the same as mine. It wouldn't have been the same as Bret's, as yours. But each of them had a specific and thought-out reason why they found Donald Trump attractive. And none of those reasons fit neatly into the stereotype of Trump voters. And I think, I mean, I've always been under the position, if we want to get beyond Donald Trump, we have to understand in a real way, and not a superficial, stereotypical way, what made him so appealing to so many voters. Because we're not going to reach those voters with someone else unless we understand that.
Well,
Sorry?
Bret, you may remember that when you were on Bill Maher a year ago, you responded to this point exactly, that there is a kind of liberal blue state prejudice about a Trump voter, and that in fact there's other ways to see them and understand them, and this is the very point that Frank is making. I'm going to get back to that in later, hopefully. I want to talk about what you think the cause of Trump, how he became our president. We'll get to that in a moment, but I want to first go back, since we talked about two of your columns, I want to get to one of yours that just came out today. It wasn't actually a column, it was a much more extended essay, and one that I think is very frequently read, and because this is the YMHA, people in this room might care about this essay in particular, and this is really about progressive liberalism and the politics that is not unfamiliar to Frank, and its obsession with Israel, the demonization, the illegitimacy of Israel, and how that oftentimes this kind of wokeness slash progressiveness also slides into anti-Semitism. And why is it that those people who feel most strongly about justice and injustice and fundamental fairness don't feel this way when it comes to Israel? Can you just sort of briefly set up that column for us today, in case you haven't read it?
Well, let me answer it in a slightly different way. I think the great fissures in politics aren't really between right and left. They're between the extremes on either end. I feel far more distant from the nationalistic, blood and soil right than I do from anyone on the center left. Why? Because I feel that I am united with people on the center left with a set of core liberal convictions. By liberal, I don't mean liberal in the sort of Upper West Side way.
Which you would know nothing about, because this is the Upper East Side.
I mean it in our belief in inalienable rights, in equality, in the centrality of a kind of human rights to the way we think about the world, freedom of speech. You know the list. And on the left, there's also a fissure between what I think of as the honorable and essential liberalism, a tradition that goes from Franklin Roosevelt to JFK, to Daniel Patrick Moynihan, to Barack Obama. People I would disagree with on all sorts of policy issues, but I think incorporate that kind of liberalism. And then a far left, which calls itself progressive, but in many respects aligns with a kind of, I don't want to say a totalitarianism, but a certain kind of attraction to totalitarian worldviews and a certain kind of fanaticism. And my great fear, and the reason that essay was written, was that I sense that views on the far left, anti-Israel views shading into anti-Semitic views that have existed on the far left for decades, and I think are familiar to most people in this audience, are bleeding into the not so far left. The idea, I mean, people talk about anti-Zionism as some kind of respectable political position. Well, hang on a second. What is anti-Zionism? Anti-Zionism is not, I don't like Benjamin Netanyahu, okay? Anti-Zionism is not, I'm opposed to settlement construction. Anti-Zionism is not Israel should make peace with the Palestinians. What anti-Zionism says is that one country, and usually one country only, has no right to exist, has no legitimacy, is practicing genocide against its neighbors. And I consider that form of that form of politics illiberal and almost invariably anti-Semitic. And people on the left, I don't know if I can do it, but people who are on the honorable center left have to stand up as fiercely to that kind of prejudice as I have tried to stand up to the bigotry and nativism that has infected too much of the right.
To some degree, it's sort of obvious that if anti-Zionism essentially means I'm against a Jewish homeland, how can it not be anti-Semitic? Because what you're really ultimately saying is, well, I kind of like the way it was before there was a Jewish homeland. I kind of like it was when there was expulsions and genocides and Jews were safe nowhere, and that was the sort of kind of way I like Jews to be, as opposed to saying, well, look, why are they not entitled to a homeland as well? And I think to some degree that is sort of a...
I mean, look, you know, it is theoretically possible to be an anti-Zionist and not be an anti-Semite. I mean, there are some Meshuggah rabbis here and there who are anti-Zionists for reasons that are theologically particular, right? And there are people who just don't believe in the concept of the nation state at all. Fine, if you don't believe in a nation state for the Jews, don't believe in it for the Danes, don't believe in it for the Czechs, don't believe in it for anyone else. But if you're then going to tell me I'm against the concept of the nation state, and the first one that has to go is the Jewish one.
Just so happens to
by the way, because
it's a coincidence.
As someone once said, because you have to start somewhere, right? Someone actually said that, a member of your profession, academia. Why didn't Trump target the academics?
I would have said the same thing about them. I do think they're the enemy of the people.
So this has to be grappled with before it assumes a kind of mantle of respectability that it doesn't deserve and that is going to taint the good name of liberalism and the honor of the Democratic Party.
All right. Let's talk, since we have a conservative and a liberal, let's talk, and you've both written about presidential hopefuls in the recent, some of your recent columns. Frank, what does the Democratic Party have to do for 2020? And we don't have to talk about specific candidates, although you did write recently about the governor from Rhode Island.
She's not a candidate.
I know, she's not a candidate, but I'm saying just in terms of the politics of the Democratic Party, does it have to be the progressivism that we're seeing now, where you're talking about a kind of war on capitalism, 70% tax rates on the richest Americans, free education, single-payer healthcare system, addressing all of wage stagnation, income inequality? Or is it possible for the Democratic Party in the year 2020 to take a much more moderate position, a little like the Rhode Island governor you were talking about? It does seem right now that what Bret wrote about with respect to Israel, progressivism is in, right? It's not enough to just say I'm liberal. Now you want to say I'm a progressive. We have a new congresswoman from Brooklyn who actually is who's invoking the words, I'm a democratic socialist. Did we imagine in our lifetime that someone in the United States was going to actually use the word socialist and that would actually get them elected, even in Brooklyn?
Well,
or from Queens.
Bernie Sanders got there before her. I mean, to a large degree, she's a mirror of those positions of the Justice Democrats and all of that. It is undeniable that the energy in the Democratic Party right now is quite far to the left among progressives. But there's a lot of variation there. So, you mentioned like 70% tax rates for the highest marginal. That sounds big today, but if you go back to the Eisenhower years, and those were not considered liberal years, you will find top marginal tax rates like that. When you look at what Elizabeth Warren is proposing in terms of her wealth tax and where it kicks in, I think it's at $10 million or something. I mean, some of those ideas aren't, in an era of income inequality as profound as ours right now, some of those ideas actually kind of have a lot of thought behind them, a lot of merit. They're not quite class warfare, but they get lumped in with other things. Those things compared to some of the stuff you saw in the Green New Deal, night and day, you know. And I do worry a little bit, you know, you ask where this is all going, I do worry a little bit that when you give the Republican Party, when you give Donald Trump a document with as much pie in the sky, far left stuff in it as the Green New Deal has, you have essentially, like, it feels to me like a big kick me sign, you know? There's been a lot of press over the last couple of days, to give you one example, over the fact that it got edited out at the last minute, but when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others sent out the fact sheet about the Green New Deal before the resolution was introduced, it had a phrase that said, there should be a guaranteed income for anyone who can't work or is unwilling to work, right? This phrase, unwilling to work, got a lot of press. Someone had the good sense, and people are still kind of doing the investigative work about this, somebody had the good sense at the last minute to take it out of the actual resolution, but hours beforehand, when the fact sheet was distributed, it was there. I see phrases like making sure there's a job or a guaranteed income or whatever for people who are unwilling to work. That's the kick me sign I'm talking about. I think the Democrats will end up nominating someone who would qualify as progressive. The question is it going to be 70% top marginal rate, ultra millionaires tax progressive, or is it going to be some of this other stuff? I don't think it's going to be some of this other stuff, because at the end of the day, I think Democrats want to win, and I think there are more sensible ones than ones living in a utopia.
Bret, I actually think you've renounced your membership in the Republican Party.
I don't feel like I can support a party that nominates and defends Roy Moore as a candidate for Senate.
Okay. So for them,
I really, the pedophilia is one of those red lines.
and that you will not cross.
Yeah.
But in order to seduce you back, I'm wondering, what does the Republican Party need to do? And I'm wondering in some ways, because there are some things, this is going to be hard, you may find this upsetting, but there probably are some things that Donald Trump has done that you support.
Yeah, I mean, look.
Right, deregulation, tax cuts, the appointment of some conservative justices, perhaps. I would think up until recently, there was a soaring stock market. So is it really just a wall that's the problem and a Magna hat? And if we could just stop focusing on immigration, we could find a moderate Republican who could somehow unseat this president? Or is there no chance that this president will not be running for president in 2020?
I once had a girlfriend who defended Mao Zedong by saying, well, he got rid of foot binding and introduced wooden chopsticks, which were much more hygienic. And I was like, and he murdered 70 million people. So, I mean, look, I have supported Trump when he got out of the Iran deal. Very controversially, I supported Brett Kavanaugh. I supported the move.
Well, not only that, he actually there's two things. There's one thing that I know these guys had in common. They're both prep school boys.
You shouldn't have mentioned that. That was confidential.
I'll tell you why I wanted to mention it, because remember, in that Kavanaugh, there was one of those Bret Stephens columns about that now that we're demonizing people that went to prep school. Let me tell you things that I learned in prep school.
Well, I mean, the prep school, look, every prep school is obviously different. I didn't go to his. At the prep school I attended, I was taught by wonderful progressive teachers who were keen to emphasize the importance of tolerance and thinking about the privileges that we enjoyed that so many others didn't. It was actually I came from Mexico City, which is a really stratified society with huge and almost insurmountable class differences. And in that sense, my prep school experience was the opposite of the stereotype of white kids sort of, wallowing in, or not wallowing in, but sort of enjoying their unearned privileges. But to get back to what you're saying, so yeah, I supported Trump on a number of things, but Daniel Patrick Moynihan had a wonderful observation. He said, the difference between liberals and conservatives is that liberals think that politics can save culture from itself, and conservatives think that ultimately culture determines the nature of politics. And I think Donald Trump is creating a culture in the Republican Party and in the conservative world that is toxic, that is bigoted, that goes against the kind of conservatism that I espouse, which believes in free markets, free trade, free speech, and an open society that favors freedom and free people in the United States and abroad. It's a conservatism that believes ultimately in opportunity and ambition and the right of humble people to rise. That's my idea of what it's about. And we can argue endlessly about what the right tax rate is for that, what the right regulatory scheme is for that. But I don't think Frank or most liberals in this room would really take vehement objection to what I just described. They'd say, oh, wait, that's liberalism, right? What's this? This is the point I made earlier. It's the same thing.
No, I would quibble with one thing.
Go.
Because I think a lot of conservatives who have found a kind of a moment of great kind of moral pride in opposing Donald Trump and had no problem with any Republican or most Republicans until Donald Trump, are not open about how much happened over the years in the Republican Party that was not far from Donald Trump's racism, that was not far from some of what he's done, and that actually set the stage for him. And I think there are a lot of ex-Republicans who look at Trump and say, great, now I can tell you we've never been anything like that. But I think some of those same Republicans, with their silence often, set the stage for Donald Trump.
So I don't disagree with you. And one of the things that the ascendancy of Trump has forced me to do in the service of intellectual honesty is look back and ask myself, why was I missing this stuff, sort of in the belly of the beast? Why did I dismiss sort of the Buchananite strain of conservatism as irrelevant to the movement? And I don't think, what Frank is saying is absolutely true.
Or Willie Horton.
You can go back and look at all sorts of instances and say, that was actually a far more significant moment than I realized. Although when I think of Willie Horton, that was in the George H.W. Bush campaign, and I think of George H.W. Bush as also the guy who signed the Americans with Disabilities Act. Totally. And I think of George W. Bush as the man who did more for AIDS relief globally than any other president. So it's important to ask ourselves, well, what are
and you're right. And I wrote, I think, two very, very appreciative things after George H.W. Bush died, one of which made the whole point that we have to start seeing things in shades of gray. That yes, George H.W. Bush was Willie Horton, but he was also some of the things that you're talking about, and we live in this bizarre political world where you have to either not mourn his death because you hated him, or mourn his death to no limit because you loved him, and see him in these black and white terms. But even W, right? What did he do in 2004 when he was running for re-election, or what did he let the people around him do? He let them put anti-gay marriage initiatives on the books of all of these different states as a way of driving the turnout of people who would be moved by that fervor. Those are the kinds of Republican tactics that predated Donald Trump and that were in some ways a harbinger.
Let me make 2 points. The small point, it was Bill Clinton who signed the Defense of Marriage.
In 1996, I'm talking about 2004, things were changing.
That's true. The second point is, what you've just heard in miniature is why Frank Bruni is the best columnist in America. And I'll tell you why. Because at the heart of every column that Frank writes is a sense of the human. It is not ideological pap. It is not some effort to come after his enemies with sledgehammers and beat them to death. It is not the marshaling of little bits of evidence that don't tell the whole story but get the column done. And I think in every Frank Bruni column you read, you're seeing a human being apply real intelligence to problems that are not ideologically easily defined. And that's why I love Frank's column. It's true.
Going back
I'm going to add another 0 to the check, I promise.
given what you've just said, did everyone not, was there no one was able to sort of really diagnose or anticipate how Donald Trump seemed to understand that he could become the Pied Piper of a kind of angry, resentful, anti-immigration, Rust Belt? I mean, how did that, I know you've written about how, well, the Democrats clearly overestimated the polling. They didn't get the polling right. But Trump seemed to know something. He seemed to see something in those rallies. He seemed to be saying something at the various debates, at the primary debates. And I don't think we've ever really yet come to terms with what it is that he was able to see and harness that in some ways, what Frank is saying, kind of existed. It was always there, but he somehow galvanized it and catalyzed it into a movement that had him elected president.
But part of it is the moment in time. So I was thinking as you were saying that, part of it is, there was anger before. The people you're talking about were falling behind before. But by the time he came along, that anger was at a fever pitch. Those people had fallen further behind. They had felt left out of the conversation and left off of people's radars for longer. And so something had become ripe at the moment that he decided to pick it. And I think sometimes we give him too much credit for the brilliance in picking that fruit when it had just ripened in time for him to do it. But I also think, you have to not only look at what he was doing, for lack of a better word, right, although I think all of it is wrong, right? You have to ask what the Democratic Party did wrong, right? I mean, how many times, Bret, in covering politics and talking to, the smartest strategists, whatever, do people say elections are about the future? Elections are about the future. Elections are about the future. Whatever else you think about her distinctions, her talents, whatever, the Democratic Party put forward someone who everything about her except the fact that she was a woman said the past, right? Okay, well, we have disagreement there.
But we almost never get hecklers.
I mean, that was a problem. The Democratic Party was also at a moment in time when I think rather than putting out, first and foremost, what felt like a unifying message that was saying, here is how we represent all Americans, it seemed to be putting out almost like pointillist messages, this for this group, this for this group, this for this group. And I don't think that resonated with a lot of Americans. And finally, on top of all of that, we look at Donald Trump's victory and say, and we say, like, what grand things can we conclude from it, right? Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that what Comey did in the final weeks hurt Hillary Clinton and helped Donald Trump. Let's say that what the Russians did on social media had an impact. Let's say the fact that pollsters were telling all these Americans, you don't even have to bother to come out and vote, Hillary's got this in the bag. At the end of the day, do we know that Donald Trump got the kind of resounding affirmation that asking what it means implies? No, we don't.
But at the same time...
it's also, there's been a strain in American history. I mean, this was certainly true and was spoken and written about back during the Depression, of the concept of the forgotten man. And I think Donald Trump spoke to the forgotten man, and I use the word man deliberately, in America. The sense that there was a world of Silicon Valley billionaires who had done nothing really to deserve their riches other than come up with an algorithm. There was a world happening on Martha's Vineyard at cocktail parties. There was a conversation taking place in New York, and all of it was just leaving millions of people out. And they were the ones, I think, who came out for Trump. The sense was, and I spoke about this on Mar, the sense was they were neglected, they were forgotten, and they were being condescended to in the process. And I think whoever the next Democratic nominee is has to be extraordinarily mindful of that, because they are at least 60 million strong.
But even with that sense of resentment, of the forgottenness, there was something really extraordinary from the first primary debate, right? Or even before it, right? Because there were these endless Trump gasp moments, right? What he said about McCain, what he said about women, right? Kellyanne Conway, there was blood coming through, her wherever.
Well, he said that the next day.
Right,
yeah,
the next day, right.
Yeah.
It wouldn't stop.
It wasn't Kellyanne Conway, he said that.
Oh, right, it couldn't have been
Megyn Kelly.
I'm sorry. And so there was this endless stream of this, and we saw this, and of course, and after the Access Hollywood tape, everyone said, now it's over. And so there is something that's fascinating about the level of forgottenness that dovetailed with the level of forgiveness, because evangelical Christians didn't seem to mind about Stormy Daniels or anybody. It seems like how much resentment was really there that they were to overlook things like when we're talking about. Frank did write wonderful little pieces about George H. Bush, about decency and dignity and humanity, and we're really not seeing this. Remember early on in this presidency, there was this, well, he's not going to be presidential, and his audience said, yeah, and we don't care. We still, that's our guy, and he knew that.
The things that you're listing, which are the right things to list as so offensive, and they are offensive, and they remain so, and they are joined by new offenses every tweet, every day, every week, people experience those things, and this is the conventional analysis, but I think it's the correct one, as authentic, right? People had become so cynical about the artificial, canned nature of politicians that the fact that Trump was throwing out that script and speaking in these ways that were supposed to be campaign killers. I thought his campaign was going to be over the day, and this was really early on, before any primary or caucus or whatever. I thought the day that he sat on a stage and said that he did not see John McCain as a hero,
Right, exactly.
and that he preferred people who weren't captured. I mean, in any other moment in time with any other person, that would and should have been the end of his political
And in a
career.
red state.
Right.
In a red state, someone would have said.
But I think there were two things, one of which is it was all offensive, and I don't think people thought that's okay, but they thought that's something real, and that's someone who's going to take a match to it, and I think this whole thing deserves to have a match taken to it. The other thing that I think has so benefited Donald Trump is when the offenses, when those jaw-dropping, head-scratching, eye-popping moments, when they come daily, they all start to blur together. Yeah. And I think he actually ends up getting off the hook by sinning so capaciously,
Well, that's precisely right. I mean, effectively, outrage becomes victim to its own ubiquity. Stalin had that line, the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic. Well, if you tell one whopping lie in your life, it'll haunt you till your grave. But if you tell 1,000, no one will remember which lies. I think there's one other aspect here that needs to be pointed out, which is, look, demagoguery works. Okay, that's why you have the Peronist phenomenon in Argentina, or Erdogan in Turkey. I mean, I sometimes see Donald Trump as kind of like the greatest striptease act in American political history, which is that...
Not that image, no.
Anything but that.
Well, look...
I'm having dinner afterwards, Bret. I gotta,
The more he showed, the more vulgar he became, the more the people liked it. And so there is a fact, Lincoln talked about the better angels of our nature. Well, he was appealing to precisely the reverse.
Let's talk a little about Twitter.
Sorry about that.
We're living in a Twitter universe. Barack Obama, I remember this in 2008 because it was a story immediately after the inauguration, that the Secret Service took away his BlackBerry. Remember, there was a thing called the BlackBerry. And he wasn't able to use one again, even though he had been he claimed to have been addicted. He had 2 of them and he couldn't have any more. That's certainly, we're living in a culture now, and again, this is important to us because twice a week you appear in, the paper of record with 825 words, I guess. I don't know what the actual number is, twice a week. And now we have the immediacy of Twitter, where people, and you're both part of that, right? You tweet, I guess.
I don't tweet that much. But where are you? You've quit, you've come back. I don't know where you
did
are.
quit.
I'm way down. I'm way down. I generally tweet my columns, and I tweet the columns of my friends.
So what about this culture in which of the immediacy, in which, one question I have is, why if we know that Donald Trump feeds off his neediness of an ego, why cover every tweet? why just blow them off?
Okay.
Why just say, is it purely for commerce? Because why don't we just say, look, I'm not going to give him what he wants. We will cover what's necessary. Our job. I almost never get applause, so thank you for that. Our job is the fourth estate, the public trust that we have to report on the news of things have a public concern. But a lot of what he's tweeting is petulance. It's not about public concern. He's just mad at somebody, and we're quoting that, and we're talking about that on CNN and MSNBC instead of saying that's really not fit news to print, and it's not really the news of the day, although it is salacious and it is provocative and it is part of the age of Trump, but it's unworthy of us.
Well, I mean, I wrote a long piece just, I think, a month ago or on this very question and what the media has to try to do differently as we go into the 2020 election from what we've been doing and what we did that perhaps actually kind of had an influence on events in 2016. You're right. I think you'll find that if you read Bret and my columns, I think you'll see us relying far less on Donald Trump's tweets than many other journalists do. But this is kind of my chance to appeal to everyone here. This has to be a collaboration. The reason you're seeing all the stuff that you just bemoaned is because people click on it. And we're living in a journalistic, and that doesn't excuse it. We have an obligation to be bigger than commercial forces, and the Times, I think, more than most publications, is bigger than those commercial forces, although we're not immune from them. We have an obligation to resist that, and we also have an obligation to try to create a journalism that you find more compelling than Donald Trump's tweets. And that's also in our interest, because Trump is going to go away at some point. And the Trump bump will go away in media, and we have to be ready for that. But this is my chance to say to this audience what I've said to others, which is your media behavior is being measured more precisely and in real time in a way like 10 years ago couldn't happen. So you're getting, whether it's on CNN, MSNBC, whether it's in the New York Times, whether it's in USA or whatever, you're getting a journalism, an apportionment of time and space that more closely resembles what you have shown you want than ever before. So we have to try to resist the easy clicks and the easy commerce, but we need our audience. If you feel like you're reading too much Donald Trump and not enough John Kasich, I was getting that question, click on John Kasich. Enough of you click on John Kasich, you'll be shocked. You'll be a media star overnight, because all of that stuff is measured as never before.
Frank knocks on wood when he hears the words, when Trump ceases to be in office. I wonder a couple questions about that. One is, given how extraordinary the last 2 years have been, if whenever it is, 2020, 2024, will we ever be able to return to the way it was, or have we now reached a different level of presidential, in every way, vulgarity, provocativeness, sensationalism? Have we lost ourselves, not just the fear of our democratic institutions, but the way we hold ourselves?
Well, I think that, this allows me to complete the question on the Republican Party. One of the reasons why I am so vociferously opposed, even when I agree with discrete policy decisions, is I think in terms of our political culture, we crossed a Rubicon with Trump. The sort of behavior that used to be unthinkable will not only be thinkable, it will be precedential with a C. It will serve as a precedent. Trump is just Trump 1.0. Soon there's going to be 2.0 and 3.0, and not only on the right, but we're going to get a Trump 3.0 on the left as well. And I fear that the only way we can sort of change the culture is to have what my mother likes to call a non-fatal catastrophe, which is to say some kind of external event which makes us more serious about our political choices and about the tenor of our politics and the character of our leaders. And we're in many ways a very fortunate nation that we can be so flippant as to elect someone like Trump into the Oval Office. In Colombia, in Israel, places that face existential crises, you can't get away with clown time in the White House. Here we can, but we won't be able to do so forever. And I think that that's the only way that's really going to shift. I mean, I read some of my former fellow travelers on the right, and I remember them from the 1990s when I was starting out in journalism. And if they had one conviction, it was that character mattered in office, and Bill Clinton didn't have the character to be president. And they said this a billion times. Do you remember a book by William Bennett, The Death of Outrage? Well, I think they were right, as a matter of fact. Where are those people now? They are our new sophists finding ever more elaborate rationalizations for why Trump's authenticity and common touch are greater signs of presidential character than anyone since George Washington. And by the way, just one final point. Every healthy democratic society needs a morally healthy conservative party, because a conservative party doesn't just represent a set of ideas, it represents a kind of psychology and a temperament that runs through about 50% of the population. And if you don't have that party, you are on the road to fascism.
Mueller investigation. Either of you think impeachment is possibly in the president's future? Do any of you think that a subpoena is waiting for him the moment that he leaves the White House?
I hate doing this guessing game. I don't think any of us know. I mean, is impeachment possible? Tell me what's going to be in the quote-unquote Mueller report. Tell me how much of it we're going to see. Tell me when we're going to see it. We just don't know.
I think he has more to worry about from the Southern District.
Everyone understands what that is. That's where they're...
This is an Upper East Side audience.
It's an Upper Rise. Let's see. One last question, and we'll take some questions from the audience. Both of you, to some degree, have taken contrarian positions that make reading your columns so interesting. I mean, I think your whole college admissions articles, which include your book, is something that certainly goes against the grain, saying that, you know, you don't have to go to an Ivy League college. Your column from just a few months ago or weeks ago about Joe Biden, I hope you don't run. Your position about that Donald Trump was the worst president for Israel, given the fact that so many, certainly conservative Jews, are so appreciative of his moving the embassy and identifying Jerusalem as its eternal capital, and
My Second Amendment column.
Right, your Second Amendment column, right, exactly. Or, of course, you know, the talk of Bret Stephens as the climate change agnostic. Is this who you guys are, or is this really what you think columnists should do? Occasionally step in a way that is completely counterintuitive, not just how the public is feeling, but even the way they would think you would normally think.
I don't know that we have the same answer to that, but I would never write a column that's not what I believe. So, I mean, if you're asking, like, do I find a position that will surprise people because it's counterintuitive? No. If I have one of those thoughts that maybe is counterintuitive or a little bit surprising, and it's genuine, am I maybe more likely to write that just to kind of hopefully remain more interesting? Sure. Because I think it's a treat for readers if they do like reading you, and I don't presume they do like reading me, if they don't know exactly what you're going to say. If you write about football one day and gay rights the next, I think that's fun. I think that's part of what a columnist can ideally do, and that extends to if you have a strong opinion that maybe doesn't fit neatly in what people would say your box is, but it is authentic and you feel it genuinely, yeah, I think you should lean into it.
I mean, I endorse everything that Frank said. You know, leaving the Journal for the Times was an intellectually interesting experience, because the Journal, the editorial page, and I was the deputy editor of it, has a way of thinking about the world. And although really what I did at the Journal was write about foreign policy, I would sort of imbibe by osmosis many of the things that the rest of the editorial page sort of said and thought, because these were my colleagues, and you sort of outsource your thinking on this or that issue. When I went to the Times, one of the things that I noticed is I started saying, well, what do I really think about this? And let me back up and think anew. And in many ways, my views remain largely unchanged. But I mean, I had what you might call a moment of clarity after the shooting in Las Vegas, when I said to myself, hang on a second, this is crazy. We have a Second Amendment that was written at a time when a skilled marksman could load a musket for one shot for maybe about 90 seconds. Now you have a mentally deranged person who can get off 90 or 115 rounds in a minute thanks to something called a bump stock. Do we really not have to rethink what this amendment is? And you know, I wrote this column that created this huge wave, repeal the Second Amendment, because I do believe that the Second Amendment kind of says what conservatives say. You have a right to own guns. And I'm skeptical of discrete gun laws where one is operative in Connecticut, but say it's not operative in New Jersey, and it's a matter of an hour's drive to move guns. So I am skeptical of this kind of liberal idea, oh, if we only had better gun regulation within the framework of the Second Amendment, we would have less gun crime. The real nature of our problem is that we have something like 300 million guns running around in the United States, and it is just simply unbelievable that we tolerate 40,000 or so deaths a year from gun violence. And this happens, I mean, it happens in Venezuela, it happens in Brazil, but it happens nowhere else in what used to be called the civilized world, and there's no reason it should happen here, and there's no reason we should accept the murder of students in high schools across America as a kind of Aztec blood sacrifice for the sake of Wayne LaPierre.
And he's a conservative, you see. All right, let's take a few questions from the audience and we'll say goodnight to our guests. Given the pressure of multiple columns a week, what do you do when you have nothing to say?
Frank?
This is like a daily problem. Yeah, thank you. He said drink, yeah.
We've learned that works.
I mean, you always have something to say. I mean, there are days when you feel you don't have something as urgent to say, and you come up with something. I mean, I don't know that there's any kind of great answer to that, but it is difficult because there are columns that I'm sure many that Bret's written. There's some that I've written that I wanted to write for a while, or at the moment I wrote them, I felt very passionate about them, and I was so happy to have that particular opportunity on that day. And then there are days where it's like, I'm tired, and the news just seems like bedlam to me, and nothing's standing out, and you just do your best, and sometimes it's not that great.
No, I mean, Charles Krauthammer's great line about columnizing was that it was like being married to a sex maniac, because no sooner have you done it than you have to do it again.
Bret, I am noticing a leitmotif to your metaphors.
And a striptease.
We've had a striptease, we've had sex maniacs. I don't want that proposal at the end of the day, no.
I think, Frank, you introduced this idea for him.
Okay.
No, when you write columns, you find, it turns out that you find that as you dig deeper into yourself, you have more to say. You can report. I mean, one of the greatest reporter columnists, again, is Frank Bruni. That wonderful column about Governor Raimondo is one of dozens he's done that way. But you can also expand the ambit of topics that you choose to cover. I mean, the column of which I am proudest from last year was a column I wrote about a climber named Alex Honnold, who climbed El Capitan without a rope. And it was made into a wonderful film, and I thought it was a surpassingly beautiful expression of the human spirit. And I'm prouder of that column than all the columns I wrote, pounding on Trump for one thing or another.
Well, you should all go read that column. I remember that column very well. It is from first syllable to last. It is just a beautiful, beautiful piece of writing.
It's a thing of beauty, yeah. Last question from the audience, and we'll say goodnight to our guests. Please comment on the recent firing of 800 plus journalists and how it relates to digital media. Now we're talking about your business. On the one hand, we started off by saying, well, Trump is good for business. And yet at the same time...
Not good enough.
But not good, right.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we are hearing about these. I think BuzzFeed just recently reported that they've laid off some people.
They laid off a bunch of people. HuffPo laid off a bunch of people.
HuffPo, for sure.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether there's a way to understand this. I mean, that's you know, they're budding journalists out here somewhere.
It is a huge concern because we have not, I mean, this all falls under the same problem, which is we have not yet found in the journalism business an economic model to replace what print advertising was, right? Print advertising kept newspapers, magazines robustly financed. They allowed people to get used to like near free journalism because it was all being essentially paid for by Tiffany and Buick and all these other places.
Macy's and Bloomingdale's, full page ad.
Right, now in the area of, I mean, now the whole advertising online thing is different, and we are, you know, we're going to a subscription model. We're trying to get readers to pay for journalism more, and they're not necessarily accustomed to that. It's a real problem because thus far no one has been able to crack that code, and it means that we're in danger of having thinner ranks of journalists than ever before. Local journalism is almost dead. I mean, it is really scary. We don't talk about it enough. But in so many communities in this country, small cities, there is no one reporting on the city council. There's no one reporting on the mayor. There's absolutely no check of that kind on local government.
It's not because, right, you're saying it's not just because there's no bureau from a major paper. You're saying there's no local paper.
There's no local paper.
Right.
There's no local paper, and there's nothing to replace the local paper. People have wondered, well, maybe citizen journalism, maybe people sort of filing FOIA requests from home and having little blogs. That hasn't really come to be, and I think that's a pipe dream. And what happens when you have, you know, governments all over the country that are operating without any scrutiny. Oversight from someone independent. I mean, I think we'll be grappling with that in the years to come, but it's something that we don't talk about enough.
I mean, we should mourn the demise of local journalism. I can't say I especially mourn the suffering at BuzzFeed or the HuffPo, because these are two publications.
Or Gawker. Right.
Well, especially Gawker, but these are publications that did a couple of things. They earned their keep often by essentially piggybacking off of the work of serious mainstream publications. And they also did so by not really reporting news, but by inhabiting a world of gossip, innuendo, and often just rank meanness that demeaned the profession. So to see their ranks thinned, I think, in the overall ecosystem of journalism is not a bad thing. You know, the papers that are going to thrive, there's always going to be a need in any country for really serious, in-depth, thoughtful reporting, because that need for the quality of information and the depth of analysis is not going to go away. And the papers that are going to thrive in the future are going to be the Times, the Journal, the Washington Post, say the Economist, a few others, because they are giving their readers a high protein, not an empty calorie diet. And that's the journalism that we really want to invest in, which is to say that if you only have one subscription to the Times, it's time to have two.
I'm so happy you're both friends, and you're both treasures of the New York Times. Thank you both.
Thank you, Van.
Frank Bruni and Bret Stephens, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Thanks for joining us. Sign up for folks.org and keep coming back to the 92nd Street Y. Good night, everyone. Thank you.